Davis. For some time we have been interviewing old-time residents of Pittsburg and Kent County. Today we continue that, and we have Mr. David Abernathy, who is longtime mayor of this city, and he's been around and knows a whole lot about a whole lot of different things. Excuse the whole lot words. But he does, and so we'll let him just talk out to his heart's content. Okay, Dave? Now, you can tell when you were born if you want to. We'll put that...
I have no objections to that. July 29th, 1912. I'll be 76 in July this year. Well, first, I'd like to go back and reminisce a little about things that I've seen change during my lifetime. I recall that when I was a student in high school, you couldn't buy radios made and sold like in later years. We had to build our own radios. And my dad and I built our first radio. It was battery operated off a 6-volt battery, storage battery. And you had to have an antenna that did not have restrictions. For example, we had two 60-foot high pipe poles with 2 strands of wire to have an antenna high enough to clear the pecan trees at our house. And the most exciting event the next day that was talked about downtown was how far you had heard a radio station. And when you heard WLS in Chicago or WLW in Cincinnati, you really had heard a long way off. So those were the first radios. Of course, later they developed the tube-type radios, and then later they went to the solid-state radios, and you have those type today. But that's just one thing I remember about radios. Now, another thing I was reminiscing about are the trains in Pittsburg. Back when we had steam engine trains in Pittsburg, we had 4 passenger trains, carried 3 to 4 cars each, on the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, which ran from Greenville, Texas to Shreveport, Louisiana. There were 2 trains during the daytime and 2 passenger trains at night. On the Cotton Belt, we had 4 passenger trains per day that ran from St. Louis to Waco, Texas. St. Louis, Missouri to Waco, Texas. And they had 3 to 4 cars each. At one time, the Cotton Belt had a hotshot passenger train that carried 7 cars and carried a sleeper and a diner on it. Then they had what they call a Lone Star Limited that ran from St. Louis to Dallas by way of commerce, and it was called a Lone Star Limited. And I've ridden on the back platform of the observation car on that train 2 or 3 times. I used to have a lot of fun when I was in high school with the boys, betting them marbles and so forth, that I could tell them the number of an engine on the Cotton Belt on the freight trains in those days. I had a great uncle that was an engineer on the Cotton Belt. Of course, they didn't know that. And we had some relatives south of Pittsburg, and he blew a certain signal when he passed their house, and I knew the signal. And so I'd bet him that I could tell him when old 550 was coming through. And I was always right. And then when the engine got to town, it had a cracked bell on it, and I'd bet him when I was standing down the school building on the Fifth Street that I could tell him what engine was switching uptown. And I was always right, because it was 550, and it had that cracked bell on it. So I had a lot of fun in those days with the trains. Then as time progressed and the passenger trains ceased to exist due to improvements in transportation and highways, well, the passenger trains were not justified from the cost standpoint. So consequently, they were discontinued except what we have today in the Amtrak system. But I rode a passenger train on the Illinois Central called the Green Diamond. It was a 6-car train, diesel, back in 1956. And we went from St. Louis to Chicago. and I was riding back in the observation car, and the speedometer was showing we were running 100 to 105 up there. And the diner had a flat wheel on it, and it was just bump, bump, bump. So I went back to eat lunch in the diner, and I told the porter back there, I says, Cap, I says, we got a flat wheel on this car. Won't you change it out? He said, well, sir, said, we've been trying for 3 or 4 months to get that car changed out, and they tell us they don't have another diner right now. And I was a little reluctant to say, well, you're running 100 miles an hour with a flat wheel on one car. Not good business as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, later the Cotton Belt was using engines, what we called a 280 class engine. It had 2 wheels under the cowcatcher and 4 driving wheels for the power of the engine. And they would pull about 40 cars, loaded cars. And they were building improving the railroad and changing some of the direction north of Pittsburg. And they had these gravel trains with 40 cars on them with double headers. They put 2 engines together to pull them. And they had 2 wrecks during this construction period where other freight trains ran into the back end of the gravel trains. I remember one time that a gravel train hit a freight train out north of town about 1.5 miles. And when it did, it wrecked a number of box cars. They were loaded with grape nuts and breakfast foods. My Lord, I never saw as much breakfast food out there scattered all over the landscape in my life. Everybody out there picking up boxes of breakfast food, just having a big time. Then later, the Cotton Belt was always a hotshot transporter of perishable goods from the Rio Grande Valley to St. Louis. And I had some friends that what we called hotboxed them, and Ed Camel was one, a preacher's son, that rode these freight trains to St. Louis. He'd catch one going up and catch another one coming back. And they were all refrigerator cars on these trains, about 40 of them. Well, later, the Cotton Belt acquired a beautiful steam engine, and they were Class 800 steam engines. And they differed from the first steam engine in that they had 4 pony trucks, 8 drivers, and they were 6 feet in diameter, and then a pony truck under the cab of the engine, and they had 12 wheels under the tender, and they were high-speed passenger engines, what they were. They were beautiful engines, and they started hauling perishable fruits with them from the valley, and the engineers on them were instructed not to spin the wheels on these engines because you'd slip the tires on the wheel. So I've seen the 800s coming from the south, and there's a curve coming into Pittsburg, and there's a hill down there, and they'd have to stop for the crossing up here where the MK&T crossed. So consequently, once they stopped up there at Quitman Street crossing, that's all she wrote. They'd have to back down about 1.5 miles south of town, and they had to send a flagman down ahead of them to be sure the track was clear before they backed up. Once they got down there in what we called Hopkins Bottom, they'd get another run at it, and then they'd make it they'd leave a brakeman up to flag the crossing at Quitman, and then the train would be able to progress past there. And they were real fine engines. When they did away with those, they sold them, part of them, to the Mexican government for their passenger trains down there. So that's just a brief history. Then they came along with the diesels, as I said, and actually I've seen the 900 class engines, which were the same type engines as the 800s on the Cotton Belt. And these 900s ran on the TP, Texas Pacific, ran through Longview to Dallas, and from Longview up to St. Louis. And then they went on west out from Dallas through Fort Worth out to El Paso and on to California. And they had the Sunshine Specials down there on the Missouri Pacific, Texas Pacific at that time, and they had 2 sections that came out of St. Louis. And the International Great Northern took off at Longview and went down to Palestine, and it split and went to Houston, and the other train went down through Austin, San Antonio, on down to Laredo, Texas. So they had two sections. The first section went through Longview on to Dallas to California. Pulled about 18 cars. And they were heavy cars, not like the aluminum cars you have today. And they pulled them with these 900 passenger engines. Well, I've clocked them over at Terrell back in steam engine days running 90 miles an hour. Well, now they only run the diesels about 55 because they don't maintain the road beds like they had it in those days when passenger trains were really important and popular. The second train section of the Sunshine Special would go down to Longview to Palestine, and then they'd split it there, and part of it go on to Houston, and the other part would go on to Austin, San Antonio, and Laredo. Then they came along with the Texas Eagle. That was the next hotshot train, and they pulled those with diesel engines for several years. Then eventually the traffic deteriorated to the point that they did not have sufficient traffic to justify the continuation of the passenger trains. So now they have the Amtrak that runs down from St. Louis through Marshall and Longview and over to Dallas, Fort Worth, down to Temple and on to Austin and to Laredo. And it's a slow train, carries about 6 cars, and not in the class with the old steam engine days. So that's a brief history of the railroads that I was familiar with. Now next, we might briefly talk about the Northeast Texas Fair. The Northeast Texas Fair was owned by a group of businessmen, including Mr. F.W. Maddox and Dr. James H. Mitchell and others. And they had a very successful fair during the late teens and through the 20s and the 30s. And the Depression came in the 30s, and consequently people didn't have any money to spend, and the fair deteriorated. In the 40s they had a fair, and I was the last president of the Northeast Texas Fair in 1950. And subsequent to that it was disbanded because of changes in transportation. Now when they had the Northeast Texas Fair, during its prime years, there were special trains that ran from Shreveport, Louisiana, Tyler, Texas, Greenville, Texas, and Texarkana to Pittsburgh to bring people to the fair. One year, the fair organization bid against the Louisiana State Fair for Locklear. He was a prominent aviator out of World War I, had 2 old bi-wing planes called Army Jennies, and his feat was to change planes in midair at approximately 500 feet from the ground. So the Northeast Texas Fair got the contract for him to perform. Well, that day when he changed planes over into we had a half-mile racetrack over there at that time. We had horse races and automobile races. We had a grandstand that seated about 500 or 600 people, and it's where the ballparks are now. But that day we had about 30,000 people at the fair to watch Locklear change planes in midair. And he would stand on the top of the wing of one plane and catch the wheel axle of the plane above him and then climb up onto the lower wing of the upper plane. So, and at that time the Northeast Texas Fair was about the 2nd largest fair in the state of Texas. So it was a real prominent fair, and it's unfortunate that due to improved transportation and road conditions that it ceased to exist. So that's briefly about the Northeast Texas Fair. Now another thing that comes to mind are refrigerators, like household refrigerators, for example. I can remember when I was a child and in high school, we had refrigerators that had a container section lined with galvanized iron, and you put a block of ice in there to keep your food cold. And you had a ice card. It was square and it had numbers on it, and you'd hang it in a diamond form to show the iceman how much ice you desired put in your refrigerator. The iceman came along with a horse pulling an ice cart, and he would saw the block of ice the size that you wanted. If you wanted 15 pounds, 25, or 75, or 100, he'd put it in there for you. Usually most refrigerators wouldn't take over 50 pounds. And he would bring it in the house with his ice tongs and put it in your refrigerator, and you didn't have to worry about it. And so later, of course, they came out with mechanical refrigerators, and one of the first was the General Electric with a big coil on top of the refrigerator, so that we didn't use ice anymore. Now, at that time that the ice was being used, we had the facility here to produce the ice was called Home Ice and Light Company. And it was owned by some fellows named Hayde Porter, Philip Delinsky, P.H. Swim, Parvin Swim, were the primary owners of that operation, and it was located between the intersection of the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad and the Cotton Belt Railroad on the north side. And the red brick building that still stands there, that's a pump station for the city water system now, housed the boilers that generated the steam to pull the turbine that generated the electricity that provided the power in the electrical power for the homes in Pittsburg. Then they had the ice plant on the north side of the electric plant where they manufactured ice, and they had a nice little office building, which is still there, where you bought your tickets to get your ice, and you took it over to the dock and gave it to the man in charge, and he gave your ice to you, and you took it for whatever purpose that you wanted. Now, in those days, there were no electric signs for fire notification to the firemen and the citizens of the town, so they had a steam siren mounted on these boilers, and they're in the power plant. So every time you'd have a fire, they'd blow this steam siren, woo, woo. And so in about 1925, the high school burned during the December vacation time. And I was in high school at that time, in about the 8th grade, I guess. So it happened, the fire alarm went off about 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. Well, it was about 27 degrees in December, and all they had was an old Model T Ford fire truck, and the volunteers wouldn't come out because the weather was bad and it's cold, and they wouldn't bring the fire truck to the fire. So the building burned, and I think the cause of it was hobos, and there were a lot of them in those days, back in the late 20s and mid-20s, and apparently they went to the high school to get out of the inclement weather and built a fire on the floor. Well, in those days, the floor sweep used to keep the floors was all sawdust. So consequently, the old pine floors in that building were saturated with oil. Well, when it caught fire, of course, the fire spread rather rapidly, and we had wood, at that time we had wood desk in the building and wood cabinets, and everything was of a combustible nature. So anyway, the building burned. Well, then the question came up, where are all these kids going to school? Well, at that time, they had the courthouse located where the fire station is downtown now, and they made the study hall in the district courtroom. Well, when district court convened, they moved the study hall over to the Methodist church, where they had an assembly room that would seat about 125 people. So we held the study hall over there during the time they had district court. Well, of course, we were going to school all over town. We had a chem lab up over what is now David Hoover's jewelry store. There was a Masonic building where the Pendergrass built his building, now occupied by them accountants. And we went to school in that building. We went to school above Cozart John's Insurance Company. We went to school in a number of other vacant buildings all over Pittsburg, downtown. So it took about 2 years to build the new facility, and which is a 3-story building, and it was subsequently torn down about 3 years ago. because the walls were pulling apart. But I graduated from the new building in 1929, and it was the second graduating class for that building. It's interesting when you look at the Pittsburgh city history, and I'm working on that now, that in trying to track schools in Pittsburgh and Camp County, when you look back in history and talk to some of the old-timers here, there were many schools throughout the county, probably 20 or 25, because in those days there was no transportation for the children, and they had to walk to school. So consequently, the schools were very numerous in Camp County. Well, as transportation improved, the schools began to get less and less, and then they'd have area schools, like we had one out on the old Ferndale Road, about 3.5 miles from town. We had one down at Center Point. We had a number of them scattered throughout the county. But what is interesting to go back and look in the history of Pittsburgh is that there was a school, a little log building about 20 by 20, located on what is now the parking lot of Piggly Wiggly, just north of the Methodist Church, across the street to College Street. And that was called Burnt, B-U-R-N-T, Burnt Academy. Well, the IOOF Lodge took that school over and ran it for 14 years. And the citizens of Pittsburgh felt that there should be a change, and they petitioned the city council of the city of Pittsburgh to take over that school, and the council did. Then the council had a bond election for $5,000 to build a new building that would be large enough to accommodate the students due to increase in population in Pittsburgh. And it was called later the Jeff Davis College. It was a 2-story brick structure. They had a water well on in the yard of the school to supply the water, drinking water for the pupils. They later put a fence around the school property, and I have a program for that school in 1897-98 showing all of the classes and all of the instructors. And it's interesting to note that there were 11 grades in that school, plus 2 years of college. So that's why they called it Jeff Davis College. And you could get a degree in sciences, and I've forgotten what the other one is, but you could get 2 degrees from that school. Then later, the students outgrew that school, and the Carnegie Library was here then. Andrew Carnegie had offered the city council $5,000 to build the first public library in Texas in about 1896, and the county, the council accepted his challenge and matched his funds with $5,000 and built the Opera House that was located on the southeast corner of the intersection of Rusk and Marshall Streets. And the city offices occupied the rooms downstairs on Marshall Street. The library was upstairs on Marshall Street, and then the Opera House was in the south part of the building. Well, in those days, opera companies traveled through the country, and they had this place for them to put on a show, and also it was a public meeting place. So later on, when the overflow, they put the overflow students from the Jeff Davis College in the Opera House, and they were taught there for several years. Then the city had a bond issue for $50,000 that built the red brick school that burned that I had previously talked about to take care of the increase in number of pupils. So that briefly gives you a history. Later, in the 20s, about 27, the city turned the school over to the Pittsburgh Independent School District. So that gives you a brief resume about the schools. Now, I want to talk about fire protection a minute, what they did in the old days. The city council had a great difficulty in getting a water system installed in the city of Pittsburgh. several attempts were made to do it. The city council had a well drilled, and it turned out to be an artesian well, but still they couldn't get anybody to develop a water system. Well, ultimately a water system was installed, and they had a 50,000-gallon overhead storage tank up on Moreland Street, located about 200 feet north on Moreland, on the east side of Moreland from Quitman Street. And it held 50,000 gallons. Well, then by gravity, it flowed into the water lines and to the fire hydrants in town, and you had about 40, 45 pounds pressure. So the council bought or had built a wheel unit. It looked like buggy wheels and had a reel on it, and they rolled the 2.5-inch hose on this reel. It had a tongue or a band, a pipe that came around the front for the firemen to tow it or pull it physically to the fire. So 3 or 4 firemen would go get it and pull it to the fire. Well, what they would do, they would start laying the hose from the fire to the hydrant. And they put a nozzle on the hose and then connected the hydrant, and all they had was hydrant pressure. And they had 2 of these hose carts, and Mr. Stansel, that lived out on Highway 11 East, maintained these 2 fire units. They had a tin shed built on the east side of the Opera House, Library, Opera House, City Hall building, and they kept these 2 hose carts in that tin building. Well, along about 1923, the city council purchased a Model T Ford fire truck that would pump 250 gallons a minute. And that was the first fire truck that the city had. Later, it purchased a Southern fire truck that was built in Dallas, Texas. And then later, it had other fire trucks. The Southern truck was a 500-gallon a minute pumper also. Then the fire station was built. The courthouse was torn down, and the fire station was built on that location and was also the home of the city offices and living quarters for the firemen, and we had room or a bay that held 2 fire trucks, the old Southern truck and the Model T truck. And I did a lot of the maintenance on the old Model T truck. I replaced the bands in the transmission and did other things, and I relieved Tommy J. Taylor, who was a full-paid fireman back in the late 20s, and while I was going through high school. And Tommy J. had to be off vacation or was ill. Well, I filled in at the fire station, drove the truck. Well, when we had the old Southern truck, an interesting thing happened. Ms. Hopkins had a building where now there's a filling station, or was a filling station, just across from the current City Hall on Rush Street, and there was a house there that belonged to Mrs. Hopkins. Then there was a 2-story house west of the Methodist Church over on Mount Pleasant Street, owned by Miss Minnie Garrett. Well, they had changed ownerships of the houses, and we had a fire alarm to the Hopkins house. Well, when I came down Main Street and I looked like a fly sitting up on that fire truck, I weighed about 110 pounds and was trying to had a steering wheel about 18 inches in diameter. And when I made a turn to the left going down Rush Street to the Hopkins house, I realized I'd made a mistake. Well, you didn't have 4-wheel brakes then. You had rear brakes that clamped onto the brake drum on the rear of that old Southern. So when I crossed Marshall Street, I backed in, turned around, and started north on Mount Pleasant Street. And when I drove up, Roy Pankers, who was then the Texaco dealer, was standing there, and he was fire chief, had his hands on his hip. Where in the hell have you been? So I ran past the plug about 5 feet, so I had to back up so we could hook up the hose to the fire hydrant, and we put the fire out. It was in the bathroom of the building. Well, that fall, I went to University of Oklahoma, and darn if the house didn't burn while I was gone. So that's what happened there. Now, as time went on, we acquired a 1948 Ford 500-gallon pumper, what we call truck number 2, and it's still owned by the city. I rebuilt it in 1953 1953 and it had a 85 horse engine in it, and I put a 145 industrial engine in it and transmission, and it would carry the mail. It'd go. So we used it. It's still in operating condition now. Later, we bought a 1963 500 pumper from Boardman, Oklahoma City. I designed the truck, put outlets on the rear instead of the side for the 2.5 connections, and put soft suction on each side of the pump so that you didn't have to take a hard suction hose and get the truck the right distance from the hydrant to hook it up. You could take the flexible hose and connect direct to the hydrant, whether the truck was in line or not. So that's one improvement we've gone through the years. In 1980, we designed another 750 pumper, and we put these same features on it. Then beginning in 1957, I built the first rural fire truck in Kemp County, and put it in service in 47, built it in 56, and it cost $4,000. And I went all over Kemp County to pie suppers and bake sales, making money to pay for that truck. Old Rita Gillespie and I built that truck. Well, that old truck is still in service today. It's subsequent to that, Stan Robinson and I built a fire truck in 1953 off a four-wheel drive military weapons carrier, and used it on rural fire service. Then I built another truck in 1971, which is still in service today, and it carries 600 gallons of water with 2.5-inch pre-connect lines and booster reel, and it was a very effective firefighting piece of equipment. Then as time went on in 76, I built another unit on a 1-ton GMC truck that carried 300 gallons of water and 1.5-inch pre-connect line, and it was a fast unit. But we had a problem with the truck going dead, the engine going dead at a fire, and couldn't start it. So it went dead on a rural fire one time, and it burned the whole front end of the truck up, burnt the brake lines off, the tires, melted all the lights, and so forth. And we fixed it up and put it back in service. Well, we had it worked on about 3 times, and they couldn't find anything wrong why it'd go dead. About 6 months later, it went dead. The fire out in the country overtook it and burnt the whole truck up. So that was the end of that one. In 1978, I built another truck, carried 250 gallons of water on a old Army vehicle, about 17 years old, 4-wheel drive, 1.25 tons. That truck is still in service. In 1980, I built another one, just like the one I built in 78. Later, we took the gasoline-driven water pump off and put in what we call a water pressure expansion unit. It's a foam generating unit, and the reason we did that is because the foam, which had been developed by the Forest Service, Texas Forest Service, could make the water last a lot longer. So we put the foam unit on it, and it's still in service. Then we built a new one in 1985, which was a showpiece of the department as far as rural trucks go, and we built this truck for $36,000. It would generate 9,500 gallons of foam, or it'll pump 950 gallons of water. I'll do them both at the same time. And it's on a truck like it in Texas. So the Texas Forest Service had a seminar at Texas A&M University last year on April 29th, and they requested permission to take this truck to A&M for a demonstration, and we sent it down there. The fireman that took it said he never saw many pictures taken of one vehicle in his life. We had all kind of requests for specifications for this truck and so forth, and he said there were pictures being taken of it from every direction. Some people crawled under it and took pictures. I told him I had news for him, that the inside of some of those valves were turned around, reversed, to make the levers all be in the end position, pushed in position, and if they built it like the picture showed, they still wouldn't work because they didn't know the inside of the valves had been reversed and so forth. So it's been a real effective piece of fire equipment, and is run on its first truck out on all structure fires, whether in the county or in the city. Now, in 1987, we had a lightning hit an oil storage tank up here west of town and blew the lid off and set the oil on fire. Well, we had 2 more storage tanks within the same vicinity. So we sent the truck I built in 1971 up there with 600 gallons of water. We sent 2 foam units up there. This one I built in 85 and the one I built in 1980. And we put that fire out in 20 minutes. And what we did, we took the water truck and put it in the middle and cooled the steel down on the tank. Then we filled it up with foam and shut that fire out in 20 minutes. You couldn't have done it without the foam units. Then last year, 1987, I built another combination unit like the one I built in 85. It will generate 7,500 gallons of foam. I pump 750 gallons of water. Now the difference is that we had to put this unit on an old 1971 International truck that the Forest Service had given us in good condition. So I built it as an integrated unit where if we could get a new chassis, we'd take the U-bolts that hold the bed to the frame and take them out and just set the frame, the bed and all on a new chassis and the U-bolts back, and we're ready to go. So it's a very effective piece of firefighting equipment, except the truck's too slow and doesn't have enough power. So we need to replace it. So that brings us up to date as far as the 8 rural fire trucks that I have built in my lifetime since 1957. I've always had an interest in firefighting equipment, and I might say that the reason that I got interested in rural fire service was a very pathetic thing happened. Cecil Guest came to the fire station one Saturday morning while I was there, and we had one 500 pumper, number 2. And he told me that a smokehouse was on fire south of town about 5 miles out on Lafayette Road. Wind was about 15 miles an hour out of the south, and said that the people that lived in a 1-by-12 boxed house north of the smokehouse that was on fire was going to lose everything they had if they didn't get some help. Well, we carried 300 gallons of water in a booster tank on this truck. So I unilaterally took the truck down there, and there was a lady there, looked like she was in her 40s, and had 2 daughters, maybe 10, 12, 13 years old. And it was in the summertime, and she had on a short sleeve shirt or a dress, and her arms were burned, just blistered, and her face was blistered. The kids' arms were blistered in their faces, and they had literally drawn a well dry with a water bucket. So I quenched down the remains of the smokehouse, and I wet down the 1-by-12 boxing on the house. I sent them to the hospital. So when I came back, I said, I'm going to do something about rural fire protection in Kemp County, and that's what started initiated the rural fire program in Kemp County that we put in operation in 1957. So my interest continues to be with fire equipment. I'm on a state advisory committee for the Texas Forest Service at this time. So it just comes natural. I'm a mechanical engineer, graduate University of Oklahoma, and it just comes natural for me to solve problems in building fire trucks. I make nearly all the brackets myself. I do all the wiring and all the plumbing. I have professionals do the welding on the tanks and professionals to paint the trucks. But other than that, I do all the design work and the plumbing, electrical, and so forth. So that takes care of that. Now for a moment, I want to talk about household appliances. Back when I was a child, you didn't have any household appliances. There wasn't any such thing. When the house I lived in, my dad had built in 1919, we had a few porcelain receptacles in the wall with a little screw-in plug that had 2 openings in it, and you did have an oscillating fan, electric, and electric iron, and that was all the electric appliances you had in those days. Well, of course, as time went on, they began to develop more sophisticated household appliances like deep fryers and electric skillets and blenders and all these other appliances. So that required additional wiring to be installed, to take care of the additional loads and more circuits. And the old house I live in, my granddad built about 1898, 99, and it didn't have any wall plugs in it, none whatever. All it had was just electric lights, and you had a pull cord that you turned them on with. It didn't have any wall switches. Now, in the house that my dad built in the late 1919, there were push-button wall switches to turn the lights on and off. On the old house I live in the 50s, I completely rewired it and installed switches wherever they were needed, and I put a number of wall plugs in wherever they were needed, and some where they weren't needed. But I was a license-bonded electrician, and I wired it like I wanted it done and put in a number of circuits. So that's what happened on the appliances. Now we have so many appliances, it's difficult to enumerate them, and they've gotten so prevalent that when you wire a kitchen now, you have to have one plug. It's nothing but for heavy appliances, which is on a private circuit. Then you may have 3 circuits in a kitchen now, where in the old days you had one for the whole house. So things have changed over the years as time goes on. Now I might touch on the old Owl Cafe. The Owl Cafe was a 24-hour cafe that was owned by Fred and Princeton Bevel. They were brothers. And it was located on Quitman Street, about, let's see, it was about the 1/3 west in the block, on the south side of Quitman Street, that's west of Market Street. And they had a cafe in there. Well, I remember one time Princeton was telling me, when they had the Northeast Texas Fair, of course, there's always people coming over. Well, the Mount Pleasant boys didn't like the Pittsburg boys, and every time they got together, they had a fight. So Langston Denman came over one night, little thin type fella. Jimmy Guest was sitting on a stool in the Owl Cafe and eating a bowl of soup. So Langston slipped up behind him and drove his head plumb through that bowl of soup. Well, it addled Jimmy first, then Jimmy got up and he got Langston down on the floor and was just pounding his head on the concrete, and Princeton had to come around and get him off of him and keep him from killing him. But they were always having fights. Now that brings on one more thing. Of course, later the Owl Cafe moved up on the northeast corner of Quitman and Mount Pleasant Street, and was run there by Princeton Bevel after Fred had died. So it was a real prominent restaurant in Pittsburg during those days. Next, I want to talk about briefly the Aldridge Skating Rink, located on Russ Street, about where Harold Plumbing is now. And back in the 20s and 30s, they had dances at this skating rink on weekends, and they had a local orchestra. It was comprised of about 5 people. Ms. Ada Holman played the piano, George Hopkins played a saxophone, Billy Hancock played a clarinet, and Guy Holman he played a clarinet, and then Pete Spencer first Cuthbert Thomas was the drummer, and then Pete Spencer replaced Cuthbert on it. But they played what we call now big-time band music, and they didn't have all this country music in those days. And the guys would dress up with their suits, go get the girls, escort them in the car, and open the door for them to get out and come to the dance. So we'd have a big dance down there that'd start about 8:30 and run till about midnight. Now they had what they called a German dance. Now one of these places where we held these dances in Pittsburg was down there about just east of the DM building, now on Quitman Street, was the first one. Then they had them at Aldridge Skating Rink. That was the most popular place. Well, then they had what they called a German dance. And when you'd wind up down to Alder skating rink at midnight. Everybody'd go to Mount Pleasant to German dance and dance till daylight. So those were quite exciting days back then. I'll never forget one time I came in from school down to Southwestern University back in '29, and I drove up down to Alder skating rink about 10 o'clock one night. Well, some of the boys from Gilmer had gotten in a fight with the boys from Mount Pleasant. And Marshall Miller from Mount Pleasant was a slender, light fellow, weighed maybe 120 pounds. And Willie D. Quinn from Gilmer was a kind of stout fellow, weighed about 175, 80 pounds. And old Marshall Miller was just cutting him with a little old penknife every time he hit him. Well, the old boy was just bloody all over, Willie D. was. And he had an uncle named Hugh Ragland that was a M.D. Doctor down at Gilmer. And I had a little Model A Ford Roadster at that time. And I told him, I said, we got to do something with Willie D. They'd stopped the fight. The Mount Pleasant boys had gotten him out of town because if he hadn't, those Gilmer boys had killed him that night. But anyway, we put Marshall Miller in my in that Model A Ford Roadster. And the floorboard kind of leaned to the right a little. And we took him up. I went and got Dr. R.Y. Lacy, my family physician, up about 11 o'clock at night, and went down to his office, which was upstairs over what was then Lockett and Reynolds drugstore. And Willie D. had been cut on the right arm, or left arm rather, between the elbow and the shoulder, a real deep cut. It cut some of the muscles and all. And Dr. Lacy put 160 stitches in him that night. Well, he'd been drinking, so Dr. Lacy didn't know how much blood he had lost, so he couldn't give him a sedative, so he just sewn him up raw. And old Willie D. was hollering, somebody knocked me out, somebody knocked me out. And we finally got Willie D. sewed up, and the boys took him back to Gilmer. So these were some of the things that happened during those days when we had the dances and so forth. Now let's see, I might say that they had a Clayton Hotel that was located where Dub Dunkett lives now. Big two-story frame building. And it was a real prominent place for the traveling salesmen that came by train to Pittsburgh and departed by train. And later they built a brick building over on Marshall Street and Market Street, Clayton Hotel. And it was a real popular place and had a fine dining room, served excellent food. And it was subsequently torn down after all of the members of the Clayton family had passed away. Well, they demolished the old hotel, and now it's just an open parking lot. But it was a great place, and the Rotary Club had lunch there for many, many years. Now, on our lumber yards, Mr. W.W. Pryor owned a lumber yard that was located down there where Bill Coker's Ford dealership is at this time at 220 Quitman. And he sold it out to a fellow named Dunaway. And then Billy Law and Buster Julian and Olin Wade worked for Dunaway. So you had these lumber yards, you had that one. Then you had W.H. Mabin and Dennis Cruz and Zellin Law, and a fellow named Marr had one. Now, Billy Law and Buster Julian bought the Marr lumber yard, and it was located at 216 Jefferson Street, back of where Patterson's furniture store is now. As a matter of fact, it's a warehouse for Patterson at this time. So that's what happened in the lumber business back in those days. The next thing I want to talk about is automobiles. When I was coming up, of course, there was still a lot of buggies and wagons, and when I was a child and in high school too, this was predominantly farm country. And the farmers worked from daylight till dark, and they only came to town on Saturday night. So all the merchants stayed open until 10 o'clock on Saturday night to accommodate the farmers. Well, what was interesting, at that time, there were only 4 street lights on Main Street. They were fluted shade lights with a 500-watt incandescent bulb in each one of them that hung on a cable across the intersection of the street. Well, one of the reoccurrences or most prevalent thing that happened on Saturday nights is Model T strip downs driving up and down Main Street. And we had several mechanics that built these units out of Model T Fords. They didn't have any fenders or running boards. They just had 2 seats on them made out of Coca-Cola sign, round gas tank behind that, and a platform to sit on, and that was it. I mean, that's all there was to it. And they'd come up there and they'd tune them up to where they just pocketed down the street to see which one could run the slowest in high gear. And Hamp Leake was one of them, and Hoss Robinson's brother was another one. And there was a fellow named, well, I can't remember his name right now. And there were about 5 of them that had these Model T Fords. And my ambition was to have a Model T strip down. That was, I thought, to be the greatest thing in the world. So when I was in high school, I bought 2 Model T Fords. I paid $1 for one and $2 for the other one, and I built me a Model T Ford. So those were great times in those days. The old Model Ts, of course, you operated with your feet. The left pedal pushed it down low gear and let it out, and it was high gear, and you hold the middle as neutral. And you hold the middle neutral, and you mash the center pedal, and that was a reverse, a backup. Then you had a foot brake over on the right. Then you had an emergency brake lever on the left that you could pull it up to hold it neutral while you cranked it. And in 1925, of course, they came out with electric starters on Model Ts, and there'd been a many a person's arm broken cranking a Model T forward when it'd kick and swing the crank the other direction. But as the Model T days went on, and could you still hear? One of the interesting things was Mr. F.E. Prince lived next door to us over on Quitman Street. We lived at 408 Quitman. And Mr. Prince owned the Pittsburg box factory. And the box factory was one that was the primary employer in Pittsburg in those days, and they took hardwood trees and made baskets and crates out of them for shipping perishable items like peaches and tomatoes, and then fruits down in the generated and vegetables generated in the Rio Grande Valley. So Mr. Prince bought a Cadillac touring car one time, about 1925, and it had an air compressor on it, and it had a little door that you opened on the side above the running board, and you put an air hose on there and pump the tires up. And I thought that was the greatest thing there was, to be able to pump the tires up. Because on Model T Ford, you had to get your wrenches and pull all those clincher tires off and patch the tube, put them back in, and then try to pump them up, and it was something else. But he had that air compressor on that Cadillac touring car, and I thought that was the greatest thing that ever happened. But one time, old man Jim Stafford lived across the street from us, from my grandmother's place that my granddad built in 1899. And old man Jim was sheriff of Camp County one time, and he was a big friend of Mr. F.E. Prince. Well, later in about the 40s, Mr. Prince bought him a Cadillac convertible. Boy, it was slick. The doors opened from the front. So one day, Mr. Jim Stafford and Mr. Prince were going to Mount Pleasant. Well, old man Jim Stafford chewed tobacco, so they were driving along about 50 miles an hour, and old man Jim opened the door to spit. Well, when he did, it blew that whole door off of the side of that convertible, and old man Prince looked over and said, "Damn it, Jim, can't you wait till I stop to spit?" So that was quite interesting. Another thing happened one time. I had an uncle that lived in Austin. He was in the dry goods business. And Mr. Prince was on his way down the Rio Grande Valley in this automobile, convertible, and he was going into Austin, and they didn't have highway patrol in those days. They just had city police. And one of the city policemen caught Mr. Prince speeding. So Mr. Prince wouldn't sign the ticket. So finally he called my uncle and says, Henry, says, what about this cop wanting me to sign this ticket? He said, well, Mr. Prince, says, you've either got to sign a ticket to go to jail. Says, that's all there is to that. So he turned over and he told the city policeman, he said, well, you might as well double it because I'm leaving just like I came in. So that took care of that. But Mr. Prince was quite a character. His wife was a great person, and he had a daughter named Marion and a son named Walter, and Walter later took over and ran the box factory. And they had the only tennis court in town, back of their house, next to where we lived. And I thought that was the greatest thing in the world, to have that native gravel tennis court over there and have laborers from down at the box factory come up and keep it lime marks on it and keep it maintained. I thought that was great, and a lot of people played tennis over there on that court. They were very generous about letting the public use it. So Mr. Prince, Tom Kelly was the supervisor of the box factory. But it was a prominent industry in those days, and they shipped many, and at that time we raised quite a few peaches in the East Texas area, and some in here in Camp County. And of course he made crates for all of those too. But it was a big operation back in those days. Now let's see what else I can talk about here a minute. I was talking about automobiles. I can remember Pat Neff's garage over on Cypress Street, and Pat built a racer that he drove in one of the races out at the Northeast Texas Fair. And we had a half-mile track, as I previously said, and we had horse races. And I saw a race out there one time when horses were running, and a 2x6 board on the inside of the racetrack had been broken, and a sharp edge stuck out, and that horse ran into that board, and it stuck straight into the front of him, between his front legs, and of course killed him. And that was most unfortunate there. Then one time we were doing a fair, we had a biplane over there, old Army Jenny from World War I, and he failed to clear the fence and fell in the pool over there in the city park. So that created a lot of excitement. But back to the automobiles. Of course, we had the Model T Fords in the early days. Then we had Chalmers, and we had Chandlers, and we had Franklins, which was an air-cooled car. And Mr. Hargrove, W.C. Hargrove, was president of the First National Bank. And he lived on Quitman Street in a big two-story brick house. And he had a big touring Franklin. That thing would seat 7 people, I guess, and it looked like a casket in front with kind of a taper to the front, and like I said, it's air-cooled engine. Then he had an Anderson, which was kind of a chummy sport little old car that'd seat 5 people, and the top would lay down on it and so forth. So those were interesting vehicles back in those days, and the city council was very restrictive on speed limits in town, with the automobiles coming into the picture and still having horses and buggies and so forth. And they were very, very strict on speed limits. They wouldn't let them drive them over 5, 10 miles an hour anywhere in town. And so it was really interesting to see that. Then later they came out with the more sophisticated automobiles. But you have to remember that back in those days, there wasn't any paved streets in town. The first paved streets in Pittsburg were installed in the business district beginning about 1918. So I remember when all the streets in the residential area of Pittsburg were native gravel streets, and they'd get corduroyed and be just rough as the dickens. Of course, the doctors all used Model T Fords to respond to their patients' calls, and they made house calls. They didn't have any hospital in those days. And they went out to the house to visit the patient who was ill. And the roads were rough and muddy and so forth. Those old Model Ts would get them there and get them back. And then later, of course, we got into the more advanced automobiles. And then later came air conditioning. There wasn't any air conditioned first cars. The first air conditioning unit you had, they had a metal container that hung on the outside of the car, and it had a lever that ran to the inside, and you dipped a piece of well, I can't think of the name of it anyway, of material into the water bath that stood about 2 inches deep in the bottom of this thing, the container, and you'd pull this up by this lever, and then the air from the outside would blow through that wet material into the car, and that's the way you kept the car cool on real hot days. Then later, of course, we got into the air conditioning like we have on cars today. So these things have changed over the years and have progressed like everything else, and we're living in a different world today as far as appliances and transportation and all these things go. So that's that takes care of that. Now, I hesitate to get into the history of Pittsburg because I'm sure this has been repeated by others, but I'll go back to say that Camp County was part of Upshur County, and Upshur County was part of Nacogdoches County, and Upshur County was divorced from Nacogdoches County in 1848. And then in 1874, John Lafette Camp, who was a legislator from Gilmer, introduced a bill to form Camp County and separate it from Upshur County as a separate county. And the reason for it was that all the business had to be transacted at Gilmer at the county seat. All marriage licenses had to be obtained there. All the fines had to be paid there. All the transfer of deeds had to be taken there. And there were so many problems involved because in inclement weather there were no roads between here and Gilmer, a distance of about 20 miles. And they had the creeks would get high in the winter, and it might be 3 months before you could get to Gilmer to do any business. So it became necessary as a community grew in Camp County to have it as a separate county. Then when they started to decide where they were going to put the county seat, there were 3 different areas vying for the county seat: Pittsburg, Center Point, and Leesburg. Well, Leesburg offered a free lot to build the county seat there, and Major W.H. Pitts, for whom Pittsburg was named and was my great-great-uncle, he offered a lot here in Pittsburg. Then later he offered $50 toward the construction of the courthouse, which was a lot of money in those days. So they had a vote of the citizens, and the counts came out roughly 500 for Pittsburg, about 259 for Leesburg, and 69 for Center Point. So that's the way the courthouse or county seat was located in Pittsburg. So I'd like to go back and reminisce a moment about some of the downtown businesses. Mr. R.P. Nichols was a dealer in farm equipment and international harvester products, and he was later, during the World War II, chairman of the draft board in Camp County. And Mr. Nichols had his international harvester business located just east of the Cotton Belt Railroad track on Quitman Street, in a building that has since been torn down, or was torn down this year. He had his dealership there. He did a thriving business with it. Later, he moved his business over to another part of town, and this was at the time he had his business there, was in the late 19s, teens, and in the 20s, early 20s. Then George Pentecost came here from Kansas City, and George established a Ford dealership in this same building long in the late, well, let's say early, about the mid-20s, I guess, because he had a dealership for Model T Fords. And then the Model A Fords came out in 1928. The last Model Ts were built in 1927. And then the Model A Fords came out in 1928. And the first Model A Fords, they had four-cylinder engines in them. They had 40 horsepower. The old Model Ts had 22 horsepower. The Model A's were a real advanced automobile. They would cruise about 50, 55. They had a top speed of 75. And they were geared so high to get that top speed that you had to put them in second gear if you got down under 15 miles an hour. They'd just jump and jerk if you didn't. So in 1929, they changed the gear ratio in the rear end of the vehicles, and the top speed is about 65, but they'd idle down to around 8 or 9 miles an hour. In 1930, the 28s and 29s all looked alike. They had kind of a round, short radiator shell on the front. Then it came to a taller radiator in the 1930s and 31s. Now, the essential difference in the 30 and 31, and the shell on the radiator of the 1930 was solid chrome with a Ford emblem in the center at the top. And in the 31s, it was black enamel with the Ford emblem at the top. And that's essentially the only difference in them. But a 31 or 30 Model A Ford Roadster was out of this world. They had side mounts where they mounted the spare wheel and tire on in troughs on each fender, front fender. And the Roadsters, of course, had removable tops. They had rumble seats in the back. The rumble seats came out in 1928 and were continued on up through the 30s and later in nearly all sport vehicles. The Fords, as Ford always told them, he'd give you any color as long as it's black. Well, I had the Model A29 Sport Roadster I had side mounts and a trunk on the back and a rumble seat and a fold-down windshield with side glasses and always a slick unit. Then they had 2 doors and 4 doors, and that's all they built. So they built a pickup later. Then in the 30s and 31s, they had essentially the same cars, a Sport Roadster. And no, they didn't either. They had a coupe in 29 and 28 too. They had a business coupe, and then they had a cabriolet. They had about 5 different cars. I was wrong on that. Then they had about the same thing in the 1930s and 31s. And now, to get a first-class, reconditioned 1931 Model A Ford Roadster would cost you around $20,000, because there's very few of them in existence, but Model A Fords are one of the most popular cars that any of the antique car clubs members have, of Model A Fords. They're the high preferred car. So we're fortunate. We started a little, what we call a Camp County Classic Car Club here about 15, 16 months ago. And we have 61 members in it now. Some of them have 3 cars, some members do. For example, Mickey Crowell, Billy Law has 3, Bobby Law has 2, I have 2, and others have 1. And the Antique Club down at Longview Kilgore only have 45 members, and they've been in existence for a number of years. So we have parades and have lots of fun and make short trips around to the different cities in the area, like Jefferson and Winsboro and Quitman and other places, Kilgore and so forth. On weekends, they take these trips around over this area. Dewey King used to be on the fire department, and Dewey was quite a fellow. He lived out on Quitman Street, just east of King Street, with his mother and father. And old Dewey had a Hudson Super 6 touring car, and that was a hot shot in those days. And they'd try to break speed records between here and Mount Pleasant. Well, at that time, they had gravel roads, and they had 4 bridges, wooden bridges, across the creeks down here in Cypress Bottom between here and Mount Pleasant. And they were one-way bridges, just wide enough for 1 car. Well, old Deary one time was coming back from Mount Pleasant, and we had what we call Devil's Dip out here. There were 2 steep hills, and they had a bridge at the bottom. And he was coming down that hill out there one time, and he met a car, and they had to pass. So they hit the bridge at the angle that laid the rail down on the bridge, and the 2 cars passed on that bridge, believe it or not. So, and Deary, at that time, is 12 miles to Mount Pleasant, and I think Deary ran it in 13 minutes. But anyway, it was real interesting. And when they had a fire, Deary was on the fire department, and when you had a fire, you could hear that old, later he had an old Mormon touring car. And you could hear that old Super 6 or that Mormon coming down that Quitman Street wide open, going to the fire. So those are some of the unusual things. One other thing I might say is that Mr. Prince, who owned the box factory, lived next door to us, as I had previously stated. He had a big 2-story greenhouse with a steeple. One Christmas, I was down in Cypress Bottom, east of Pittsburg, about 5.5 miles, getting some bamboo, what we call bamboo in those days. It's actually ivy out of some trees to ship to my mother up at OU, who was house mother for Phi Alpha Theta fraternity. And I heard the siren, fire siren down there. When I got back to town, Mr. Prince's house was on fire, and it burned. And that was the last of that house. Then Walter Prince, his son, built the house across the street from this location. And where the house burned is now the Pittsburg clinic, medical doctor's clinic. And across the street from that, Walter Prince years ago, who married Doris from Mount Pleasant, built that house and lived in it and had power fixed to where he could use electricity from the box factory or use electricity off the public electrical system, which I thought was a great feature at that time. And he and Mary and his wife lived there for a number of years, and her name was Duncan before she married him. Then they subsequently, after they sold out the box factory, they moved to California, and they